In November of 2008, a high school biology trip to Blackwood Ridge in the Cascade Mountains turned into a waking nightmare. 17-year-old Clara Vance and her respected teacher Julian Hayes disappeared into the freezing woods without a trace. 7 long, agonizing months had passed. There was absolutely no hope left until 2 timber cruisers in a remote, impassable part of the mountain came across a violently blocked-off mining drift. What they saw inside shocked even experienced rescuers. This is a story that begins like many others, and then becomes something else entirely. Julian Hayes was known throughout the district as a strict disciplinarian, a decent man who measured his words carefully and demanded the same intense focus from his students. As the hike began, he walked at the front of the line, his heavy leather boots crunching rhythmically on the frosted gravel. Clara Vance dragged near the very back. She stopped frequently, kneeling in the damp earth to sketch the twisted roots and the pale, strange winter fungi clinging to the rotting oak trees. Around 1:45 in the afternoon, the trail narrowed drastically, forcing the restless teenagers into a single-file line pressed hard against a steep, rocky embankment. Clara knelt to tie her hiking boot, her heavy canvas backpack slipping awkwardly off her shoulder. The rest of the group rounded a sharp bend, completely obscured by a dense thicket of towering Douglas firs. When Julian stopped to count heads and noticed she was missing, he did what any responsible educator would do. He told the others to stay put. He turned back. He walked into the deep shadows of the trees. What really happened that morning? The shivering students waited near a wooden trail marker. 10 minutes bled into 20. The wind picked up, biting fiercely through their thin windbreakers, whispering a low, hollow sound through the upper canopy. The second chaperone, growing increasingly anxious, walked back to the bend to call out to them. Nothing. The trail was completely empty, stretching out like a dead gray ribbon into the fog. Panic is a slow-burning ember before it finally catches fire. 30 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Suddenly, a boy ran in screaming his name, his voice cracking violently against the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. He had rushed down a steep side path, hoping to spot Julian and Clara taking a shortcut, but found only undisturbed frost and broken twigs. The chaperone frantically dialed 911, but the remote elevation offered 0 cellular service. They had to practically run 2 miles back down the slick trail just to reach the ranger station and get a signal out. By the time the first county patrol car arrived, dusk was already strangling the remaining daylight. Temperatures plummeted below freezing. The woods grew thick and impenetrable. It looked ordinary, but it wasn't. They had simply ceased to exist. Authorities were slow to respond. The police initially treated it like a runaway. In a rural town where nothing of consequence usually happens, local enforcement often relies on the path of least resistance to explain away anomalies. Clara was characterized as a brooding, isolated teenager. Julian was a man dealing with a recent, painfully quiet separation from his wife. The shameful narrative practically wrote itself for a lazy investigator wanting to clock out before the snowstorm hit. Despite the freezing rain that began to fall, turning the mountain paths to treacherous slick stone, the official search felt heartbreakingly sluggish. When a mother pleads for help and gets little more than a shrug, you have to ask why. Clara's mother, Evelyn, a heartbroken mother completely destroyed by fear, stood in the sterile lobby of the precinct, tears streaming down her face. She begged for helicopters, for tracking dogs, for anything to find her daughter in the freezing dark. The desk sergeant coldly told her to go home, make a pot of coffee, and wait for a phone call. Some call that incompetence, others something darker. The horror of not knowing began to take root deep in Evelyn's chest, a heavy, suffocating weight that would not lift. Within a matter of days, vicious rumors began to poison the town's water cooler conversations. A note found later in Julian's classroom desk became the absolute catalyst for a devastating public smear campaign. It was an essay Clara had submitted weeks prior, at the bottom of which she had scribbled in red ink, "Thanks for being the only one who really listens." To a seasoned, rational detective, it was the innocent gratitude of a lonely kid navigating a tough semester. To a hungry local media and a paranoid whispering community, it was a blatant confession of an illicit romance. Handwriting that was never conclusively verified was paraded on the evening broadcasts like irrefutable gospel. Claims emerged that Julian had been meticulously planning this escape for weeks. Allegedly, he had emptied a modest savings account days prior to the field trip. Later audits proved this was merely to pay a local roofing contractor, but the truth no longer mattered. The community shook with misplaced righteous anger. People love a villain much more than they love the messy truth. Under the cover of darkness, angry neighbors hurled river rocks through the windows of Julian's elderly mother's home. His mother never stopped searching. She insisted, over and over and over, that he wasn't a runaway. She knew her boy with a profound, unshakable certainty. She knew he would never abandon his teaching duties. He would never lay a hand on a child, and he certainly would never leave this earth without saying goodbye to her. She refused to let her child fade into the ugly, predatory caricature the newspapers had so eagerly drawn. Drawing from her meager retirement pension, she printed out thousands of glossy flyers. She drove her rusted sedan through blinding snowstorms to staple his smiling, kind face to every telephone pole in 3 neighboring counties. Over and over and over, she met closed doors, dial tones, and averted eyes from people who had known her for decades. The police officially scaled back the search after just 10 days. They cruelly branded it a voluntary disappearance, a scandalous elopement. The files were shoved into a manila folder and shuffled to the back of a metal cabinet. Who benefits if the truth never comes out? Sometimes it's simply the people who don't want to do the hard, terrifying work of looking into the abyss. But the abyss was out there, breathing in the cold air, waiting. There are claims that the initial investigation actively ignored crucial witness statements entirely, burying evidence that contradicted their runaway theory. Let's look at what we know versus what remains unclear. We know they vanished on a relatively high-traffic trail, yet miraculously, no one directly saw them leave the marked path. What remains unclear is the exact sequence of events immediately following Julian, turning that blind bend in the woods. A witness described a rusted, dark green pickup truck parked illegally near a restricted logging service road about 2 miles from the Whispering Pines trailhead. A man asked for directions to the old copper mines, his face heavily obscured by the pulled-down brim of a stained hunting cap and the thick collar of a military coat. When the witness casually approached the driver's side to offer a map, the man abruptly rolled up the window. The car pulled away so fast the tires screeched, kicking up a violent, blinding cloud of sharp gravel. Why did witnesses stay silent for so long before coming forward with this? This staggering detail was buried on page 42 of the preliminary report. It was ignored. Most of the time, missing persons cases resolve within the first 72 hours. Someone is found, or a tragic accident is uncovered. Then there are some cases that don't fit. Weeks dragged into a bitter, relentless winter. The snow piled dangerously high, burying Blackwood Ridge under 4 solid feet of compacted ice, effectively sealing away whatever dark secrets the mountain held. The town moved on, but the families remained trapped in an agonizing purgatory. Imagine waiting 15 years for a knock on the door. Some families do exactly that, living half-lives in the shadow of an empty chair. The family's nightmare in Blackwood was absolute. Evelyn Vance woke up every single morning at 4 a.m., pacing the cold hardwood floors of her empty house, staring out into the pitch-black tree line, waiting for a ghost to walk out. Then, in early February, an incredibly odd piece of evidence materialized out of nowhere to shatter the silence. A dollar bill marked with a message was handed to a teenage cashier at a dingy, fluorescent-lit gas station 60 miles south of Blackwood. Scrawled in erratic, fading blue ink along the top margin with the desperate words, "Help me. CV, the dark water." Was it a cruel hoax? A bored teenager playing a sick, theatrical prank on a grieving town? The local police department certainly thought so. They bagged it, logged it in the evidence room, and promptly dismissed it as garbage. What some have suggested, however, is that this was Clara's desperate, calculated attempt to reach the outside world through the only medium she could secretly access. Compare that to later cases in the region, where abducted individuals utilized incredibly mundane objects like marked coins or receipts to leave breadcrumb trails for their rescuers. And the careless dismissal of the bill feels almost criminal. But without a physical location attached to the vague words, the dollar bill was nothing but a whisper in a hurricane. Spring eventually thawed the frozen, unforgiving ground. The mountain streams swelled with violent, rushing runoff. 7 long, agonizing months had passed. 7 months of slander, of quiet tears, of deafening silence. The scandalous case of the runaway teacher and his naive student was fully cemented as local lore. Until an overcast Tuesday in May, when 2 timber cruisers working for a private logging firm ventured into a designated off-limits zone known as Devil's Tooth Gorge. This specific area of the mountain was notoriously hostile and unmapped. Sheer limestone cliffs, deep, shadowy ravines, and dense thickets of razor-sharp thorn bushes made it nearly impassable for casual hikers. The loggers were out marking diseased trees for a future harvest when they noticed an entirely unnatural formation of heavy boulders pushed aggressively against the base of a jagged cliff. The vibrant green moss had been violently scraped away. The rocks were stacked intentionally, creating a crude seal over a fracture in the stone. Curious, and armed only with a heavy iron crowbar and a high-powered flashlight, they cautiously approached. They pried one of the smaller, wedged rocks loose. A sudden gust of freezing, foul-smelling air rushed out from the darkness, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. It was an abandoned mining drift, long forgotten by modern cartographers. One of the men shined his halogen light deep into the void. At first, he saw only scattered trash, empty metal soup cans, heavily soiled rags, crushed plastic water jugs. Then, the beam caught the dull, terrifying gleam of heavy metal. And then, a pale, trembling figure shrank back violently against the damp stone wall. It was Clara Vance. She was alive, but only barely. She looked like a fragile ghost wrapped tightly in decaying, moth-eaten blankets. Her eyes, wide and completely unaccustomed to the bright, piercing beam of the flashlight, stared back at the loggers with hollow, unblinking terror. The men froze, their breath catching painfully in their throats. They called out to her gently, but she only whimpered, scrambling backward in the dirt like a terrified animal. That was when they heard the sickening metallic clink. A heavy, rusted industrial chain was locked securely around her right ankle. The metal had worn deep into her skin. The other end was bolted directly into the cavern wall with a massive steel anchor. She hadn't run away. She had been brutally snatched, dragged into the earth, and buried alive by a monster. The loggers scrambled frantically over the rocks, wrapping their thick flannel jackets around her violently shivering frame, and radioed for immediate emergency extraction. When the rescue crew finally arrived with heavy hydraulic bolt cutters, breaking the iron bond that had held her in the dark for over 200 days, Clara spoke her first words. She didn't immediately ask for her mother, though she wept when they said she was safe. She didn't ask for food or water. Her voice was a broken, raspy whisper, almost entirely destroyed by months of forced silence and severe dehydration. She grabbed the reflective sleeve of the nearest paramedic with surprising, desperate strength. She pleaded. She insisted, again and again, with frantic urgency. "Where is Mr. Hayes? Is he okay? You have to find him. He tried to stop him. He tried to save me." The seasoned paramedics exchanged utterly stunned, heartbroken looks. The heavily armed police officers standing guard near the cave entrance felt the blood drain rapidly from their faces. In a matter of mere seconds, the entire vile narrative they had meticulously built and fed to the trusting public crumbled to dust in the mountain wind. Julian Hayes was not a predator. He was not a coward or a fugitive. He was a profound hero who had charged headfirst into a living nightmare to protect a child. The sickening realization swept through the canyon. If Julian hadn't taken Clara, who did? And far more pressingly, where was Julian's body? Clara's physical recovery in the bright, sterile hospital wing was agonizingly slow, but her memory of the trauma was terrifyingly sharp. She recounted the horrifying events of that November afternoon with chilling, precise clarity. According to the official logs of her interview, when Julian had walked back around the bend to find her tying her shoe, a man suddenly stepped out from the dense juniper bush. A massive, imposing man wearing faded military surplus gear and a black woolen ski mask. He didn't speak a single word. He just raised a heavy, black hunting rifle and aimed it squarely at Clara's chest. He aggressively motioned for them to move off the marked trail. They vanished into the treacherous ravine entirely because they were forced at gunpoint, stepping carefully on bare rocks so they wouldn't leave easily trackable footprints in the mud. They were marched for hours deeper into the wilderness. When they finally reached an overgrown, abandoned logging dirt road, an old, rusted green pickup truck was waiting in the shadows. The masked man demanded Clara get into the rusted metal toolbox, securely bolted to the bed of the truck. That was when Julian Hayes made his final, defiant, incredibly brave choice. He knew with absolute certainty that if she got in that metal box, she was dead. He didn't hesitate to weigh the odds. He didn't beg for mercy from a man who clearly possessed none. With entirely bare hands, Julian lunged fiercely at the armed giant, striking him hard in the jaw, grabbing the hot barrel of the rifle, forcing it upward into the air. "Run, Clara!" He screamed with everything he had. She tried. She scrambled desperately up the muddy embankment, but her boots slipped repeatedly on the wet, decaying leaves. Behind her, she heard the sickening thud of heavy fists against bone, the violent snapping of dry branches, and then 2 deafening, echoing gunshots. She turned her head just in time to see her beloved teacher collapse backward onto the forest floor. The masked man stood over him, breathing heavily, entirely unfazed by the murder. Before Clara could process the sheer horror, he was on her. He snatched her by the hair, grabbed her wrists with crushing force, and shoved her violently into the dark metal box. The lid slammed shut, sealing her in blackness. For months, this nameless phantom kept her chained in the dark limestone cave. He visited every few days, dropping off meager, tasteless rations. He almost never spoke to her, refusing to give her a voice to latch onto. He never demanded anything specific. He simply watched her in the beam of his lantern, treating her like a captive animal, a rare prize locked permanently away from the prying eyes of the world. Based on Clara's detailed description of the truck and the specific mechanical sounds of the journey she memorized while trapped in the box, investigators began frantically cross-referencing local databases. The description perfectly matched a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a heavily bearded, 50-year-old former miner who lived completely off the grid, deep in a heavily wooded parcel of land near the old copper claims. He had a lengthy, violent history of local altercations, severe clinical paranoia, and an intense, documented hatred for trespassers. A claim that surfaced months later pointed to Thorne purchasing industrial chain with cash. Some believe he had been watching the school groups for years. A community shook as the true face of the monster was finally revealed. Law enforcement immediately mobilized a heavily armed tactical team. Approaching Elias Thorne's property was exactly like walking into a booby-trapped, paranoid fortress. His ramshackle, decaying wooden cabin sat at the absolute bottom of a steep basin, heavily surrounded by rusted car chassis, broken appliances, and towering piles of scrap metal. Vicious, half-wild guard dogs patrolled the muddy perimeter on heavy, clinking chain leads. The freezing air was thick with the foul smell of burning plastic and rotting meat. The tactical team moved in slowly under the thick cover of a suffocating pre-dawn fog. They knew Thorne was heavily armed and intimately familiar with every single tree and blind spot on his vast land. When the police finally breached the heavy front door with a steel battering ram, Thorne didn't surrender quietly or raise his hands. He immediately opened fire with a pump-action shotgun, blowing out the front windows and sending splintered wood raining down violently on the officers. They returned fire in a deafening barrage, overwhelming the small cabin in seconds. When the thick, acrid smoke finally cleared, Elias Thorne lay dead on his filthy kitchen floor, his weapon still tightly gripped in his bloodied hands. The immediate, terrifying threat was permanently eliminated, but the tragedy was far from over for the town. Inside Thorne's disgusting, cluttered cabin, investigators found Clara's missing canvas backpack, her delicate nature sketches, scattered carelessly across a grease-stained table. They found a sickening collection of horrific trophies lining a high shelf. And under a loose, creaking floorboard in the bedroom, they found Julian Hayes's engraved silver wedding band. The frantic search for the brave teacher's remains shifted immediately to the wide perimeter of Thorne's property. 3 days later, police divers plunged into a flooded, abandoned quarry pit half a mile from the cabin, the very same dark water Clara had desperately tried to warn them about on that faded dollar bill. At the bottom of the freezing pit, wrapped tight in heavy industrial tarp and weighed down securely with cinder blocks, they finally found him. The medical autopsy confirmed exactly what Clara had said from her hospital bed. Julian had died fiercely fighting. His knuckles were deeply bruised and broken. He had fought a monster to his absolute dying breath. The town of Blackwood Ridge was suddenly forced to look directly at its own ugly, judgmental reflection. The local newspapers that had so eagerly branded Julian a predatory monster now printed retraction after retraction in bold ink, declaring him a selfless martyr. A sprawling, deeply emotional memorial service was held in the high school gymnasium. Clara Vance, walking slowly with a pronounced limp and leaning heavily on her mother for support, stepped up bravely to the wooden podium. She looked out at the weeping, silent crowd, at the police officers who had so quickly dismissed her, at the community that had spat venom on a dead man's reputation. She spoke softly into the microphone, but her words echoed with unshakable, profound power. "He wasn't running away," she said, her voice finally steady and clear. "He stepped directly in front of a bullet for a girl he barely even knew. He is the only reason I am breathing today." There was not a dry eye in the cavernous room as the weight of her survival settled over them all. Julian's elderly mother sat proudly in the front row, clutching a framed, smiling photograph of her son tightly to her chest. The horror of not knowing was finally, blessedly over, but the deep, aching grief would last forever. She had been right all along. She had stood alone against a vicious tide of ugly rumors, armed only with a mother's absolute, unwavering conviction in the inherent goodness of her child. The town eventually erected a beautiful bronze plaque at the Whispering Pines trailhead in Julian's distinct honor, a permanent weathering reminder of immense courage in the face of unspeakable evil. But as the long years pass, the brass plaque naturally grows tarnished by the rain, and the vast forest slowly reclaims its wild, silent edge. People walk past it every single day, completely unaware of the blood soaked into the soil, just a few miles off the beaten path. Elias Thorne took many dark secrets with him to his violent grave. When federal investigators scoured the absolute ruins of his cabin, they found a massive topographic map of the Cascade Mountain Range tacked securely to the wall. It was dotted with dozens of bright red pushpins. One pin accurately marked Clara's limestone cave. Another marked the dark water of the quarry where Julian was tragically found. But there were 11 other pins scattered across hundreds of miles of remote, unforgiving wilderness. To this very day, no one knows what those other pins truly signify. Police have dug tirelessly at 3 of the designated locations, finding nothing but undisturbed soil and ancient bedrock. Are they future sites he was meticulously preparing for new victims? Or are they the unmarked, lonely graves of those who disappeared before Clara ever set foot on that trail? Sometimes, justice is absolute and comforting. Other times, it leaves the heavy door cracked open, just enough to let the freezing cold wind in. This is a story that ends, but the questions remain, echoing through the dark, ancient trees over and over and over again.